Good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. First, 11 suspects in the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi have faced court in Saudi Arabia for the very first time. Now, the Saudi prosecutor is seeking the death penalty for 5 of the accused. Khashoggi was last seen alive on October the 2nd. Now, he entered the Saudi consulate in Istanbul and was never seen again. The next day, Turkish security sources said they had information that he'd been killed inside the consulate and his body dismembered. Saudi Arabia rejected the claim as lies. Then Turkish media published images of a 15-member Saudi hit team that arrived in Istanbul on the same day that Khashoggi disappeared and said the group was at the consular building when the journalist arrived. From this point onwards, evidence linking not only Saudi Arabia but Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to Khashoggi's death has been piling up. In mid-October, the Saudis finally admitted he'd been killed, but said it was accidental. Turkey insists it was murder, and on November the 10th, it shared recordings from inside the consulate with Britain, France, Germany, the US and the Saudis. 5 days later, Riyadh charged 11 suspects for the killing. Our correspondents are covering all angles of this breaking news story. They're with me now. Jamal Khashoggi has covered this story extensively. He's with me in Doha. Kimberly Halkett is tracking reaction from Washington, D.C. But let's begin with Sinem Kusulu in Ankara, Turkey's capital. And of course, Turkish officials have actually been perhaps caught off guard by this news as they host a range of officials from the US today on very also important pressing issues.
Exactly, Sohail. Turkish officials are busy with the official visits paid by some regional leaders and also with a U.S. delegation. But I have to say that Turkish officials do not immediately give reaction to these kinds of statements. At least a few hours passes by normally. But my first contact with the foreign ministry was as such they would be reassessing this statement. So that was a diplomatic response, of course, by the foreign ministry side. But I have to say that the Saudi prosecutors ask for a death penalty will probably not be welcomed by the Turkish officials because first, death penalty even was abolished in 2004 in Turkey. And when these death penalty possibilities were being discussed before, Turkish officials have always received it as the silencing of the witnesses, the only witnesses who actually saw the murder. By the way, another thing is that we don't know the names, identities of those 11 people who have been arrested by the Saudi prosecutor's office, and even those 5 people. Who are they? Who are their names? Were they how they were involved in this murder of Jamal Khashoggi? We will wait and see what the Turkish response will be, but of course, Turks will not see it as neither a cooperation or a solution.
Well, for the moment, Sinem, we'll leave it there, of course, and come back to you as we get more developments coming out of Ankara. Let's cross over to Jamal Khashoggi, who's covering the story for us from Doha. And you've been on this story really from day one, Jamal. Sketchy details, really, about who's actually in court and who's possibly facing that death sentence. But either way, it's going to annoy the Turks that these individuals are now present in a Saudi court when Saudi Arabia hasn't offered these individuals for questioning to the Turkish authorities.
Of course, I mean, off the bat, Sohail, the Turks have from the very beginning requested that the suspects that they believe to be behind the murder of Jamal Khashoggi be extradited to Turkey, if not for questioning, then if not for standing trial, then at least for questioning. And obviously, that's something that Riyadh has rejected wholeheartedly. But also, human rights organizations and other groups have been worried about the transparency with regards to how the Saudis have been dealing with this. You mentioned in the lead up to this story, as we were reminding our viewers of how it transpired, the amount of inconsistencies that were in the Saudi narrative from the very beginning would make it very difficult for anybody to maybe see some sort of credible court or judgment being handed out with regards to this case from the Saudis, who are the key culprits or suspects in this. So if we look at the fact that the Saudis denied that Jamal Khashoggi was still in the consulate and insisted he had left, then denied knowing where he was, then denied that he was killed, then denied that he was killed on purpose and said that actually it was by accident. And, you know, inconsistency after inconsistency would make it very difficult for people to understand how the international community or the Turks or any organization would view a trial taking place in Riyadh by the Saudis, a trial where there is no observers, where there is no media, where there is no kind of third party watching it, how that's going to serve some sort of justice.
And of course, while the Turks and the Saudis continue the sort of diplomatic spat that's been ongoing since October, today's developments are not going to sit very well with the international community, and perhaps even insist on those growing calls for an international investigation, one that Turkey keeps saying it wants to see happen. But in another way, there's no traction on it, Jamal, and one wonders where we move on from here in terms of any international investigation.
Well, indeed. I mean, as you mentioned, there have been organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, also those who are defenders of press freedom, who have called for an international investigation, namely one led by the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. But even though the Turks, as you mentioned themselves, through the foreign minister and even through President Recep Tayyip Erdogan on one occasion, have said that they would like, or have almost hinted at the fact that if Saudi doesn't cooperate, then they would defer this to an international body. It is the key is with them for that to happen. So because this happened, albeit inside the Saudi consulate, but inside Turkey, it is for Turkey to request the United Nations to come in and investigate this independently. So it's not enough for the Turkish officials to say, well, we would like to see an international investigation. We will threaten to go to an international investigation. If they actually don't do this, then what we're left with is essentially this current situation. The Saudis, on the one hand, trying to maybe convince the world that somehow there is some sort of judicial integrity that has come about over the past 24 hours, and somehow the Saudis are actually looking to find justice for a crime that many believe actually was committed at the behest of the highest level in the region. And on the other hand, you have the Turks frustrated because essentially their national sovereignty has been affronted, and that they have been seen as incapable or unable to exert that justice for the crime that's been committed inside their country.
And just briefly, Jamal, if we look at it from a different perspective now, we've got an ongoing spat between Riyadh and Ankara, and both of them looking to the US for some sort of, dare I say it, guidance, support, advice. We're going to go to Kimberly Halkett in a moment for that perspective. But in terms of the Turkish sources that you've been speaking to in the last 3 months, how do they actually see the way the Turkish government is dealing with this issue when it comes to the needs that they want from Washington in trying to get some traction on justice for Jamal Khashoggi?
Well, look, I mean, officially, the Turks will say that they are dealing with this independently. This is a criminal investigation, that this has no impact on bilateral agreements or relationships with other countries. In reality, though, this case is a lot bigger than a criminal one because of the impact it has on Saudi Arabia, on the relationship between Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Donald Trump, the US president, on Turkey standing within the region and that regional rivalry between Ankara and Riyadh. So there's no sane person who would say that the international politics doesn't implement or impact rather on this. The fact that you have seen some sort of warming of relationships, the fact that Ankara felt it needed to share the evidence it had with Gina Haspel, the head of the CIA, proves that actually the relationship between Ankara and Washington does impact on the way in which this will go forward. How that's transpired, obviously, analysts will kind of detract different kind of theories from the different developments that have taken place. But definitely there is a close coordination, let's say, at least in terms of sharing information and trying to find a way forward between Ankara and Washington.
We shall see what happens, certainly in the coming hours. For the moment, Jamal, thank you. Now, last month, the US senators passed a resolution blaming Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Let's just check in with White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett, who's in D.C. Of course, it's all changed in American politics there, Kimberly, for both houses. I mean, before the Christmas break, we saw the Senate make a very clear position on Jamal Khashoggi's case. Now, a new House of Representatives under Democratic rule will have its say, and potentially the president under more pressure.
Certainly, there is going to be more pressure on the president with respect to this issue with Democrats in control of the House of Representatives convening today for the 116th Congress. As you point out, there were not one but two measures that were passed in December by the U.S. Senate, and they certainly did rebuke Trump for his handling of the case of Jamal Khashoggi so far, specifically the fact that he has disregarded the assessment of the CIA, concluding that the Saudi Crown Prince was responsible for ordering the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. So not only did we see that rebuke with respect to the murder, but also we saw legislation passed in the Senate that ultimately changes the direction of U.S. support in terms of military support for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. But that process stalled in the House of Representatives. Why? Because it was controlled by Republicans that are supportive of the president. But today is a pivotal day, as you point out. Now Democrats in control of the House of Representatives, and we already know that the now incoming chair of the House Intelligence Committee, a man by the name of Adam Schiff, has promised that he will do what he calls a, quote, deep dive into this issue. So expect that we could, if not see public hearings on the House side, certainly see hearings being held behind closed doors at the committee level, where they will re-examine the intelligence and the assessment by the CIA and essentially the conclusions of the president. What will this do? This could put pressure on the president and could lead to the legislation that was passed in the Senate also being passed in the House of Representatives. What happens then? Then it would go to the White House, where the president would have a very difficult decision. He would have to decide whether or not to sign it into law. If he signs it into law, this would ultimately change a U.S.-Saudi relationship that has been in place for decades. But what many suspect is the president will decide to veto that legislation if it gets that far, essentially siding with the Saudis and against the will of the American people. So this is where things stand right now. Don't expect that this could happen in the short term, given the fact that there is a government shutdown taking place in the United States right now and an argument over reopening it, funding the government, and also the issue of border security. But this is certainly something that could be revived in the coming weeks and months.
Indeed, and the day is very young there on the East Coast, and we'll expect reaction as everyone wakes up to that news coming out of Riyadh. For the moment, Kimberly, thank you.